China was economically a very weak power, certainly relative to the United States in, let's say, 1990. And what the United States decided to do at that point in time was adopt a policy of engagement toward China. This was the unipolar moment, and liberal ideology dominated in the United States. We were not worried about realist logic. Realists were seen as dinosaurs at the time. So what happens is the United States decides that it's going to adopt a policy of engagement with China, which is designed to make China powerful economically. In other words, we, the United States, fuel economic growth in China throughout the 90s and throughout the first at least 1.5 decades of the 21st century. And China, of course, grows more powerful. And when realists like me say this is not a smart thing to do because you're creating a peer competitor, most policymakers and most pundits and most analysts in the United States argue that's wrong, because what's going to happen is that as China gets more powerful economically and as it's integrated into institutions all around the world, these are American-dominated institutions, as the Chinese are brought into those institutions, that China will become eventually a liberal democracy. It will be hooked on capitalism, and it will become a responsible stakeholder because it participates in all of these institutions. And the end result is that this powerful China will live happily ever after with the United States because they are both liberal democracies. And because they're both liberal democracies, we should expect a peaceful world. If you look at what the Chinese are saying at the time, they also have an ideological story to tell. This is the story that Jeff tells, Jeff Sachs, right? And that is that China is dominated by a Confucian ideology, right? And what the Chinese are emphasizing throughout the 1990s, and again in the early 21st century, is that they can rise peacefully because they have a Confucian culture. They don't believe in realpolitik. They don't believe in the ideas of John Mearsheimer any more than the Americans do. So you have these two countries, the United States and China, right, that are fueled by different ideologies that nevertheless both emphasize peaceful rise. The American liberal theory of international politics emphasizes peaceful rise, and Confucianism emphasizes peaceful rise. So for many years, people think that as China grows more powerful, right, as it's integrated into institutions like the World Trade Organization, which really fuels its economic growth, that there's not going to be any problem. Now, my argument all along, and I was pretty much a lone voice in the wilderness, was this is not the way you want to think about this. Because as China gets more powerful, it's going to want to dominate East Asia. It's going to want to act like the United States. In other words, realist logic is going to kick in. But most people thought that I was living in the wrong century and that this is just not the way the world works. We live in a world where ideologies like Confucianism and liberal democracy prevail, and we would be okay. That was the view. But as happened, China began to grow more and more powerful. It began to look more and more like a peer competitor of the United States when you looked at its economic capabilities, and then it began to change, to translate those economic capabilities into military capabilities. And the end result is that the United States started fearing China. That's what happened. It's exactly what I would expect. The Chinese argued that what they were doing was purely defensive in nature. The Chinese said, what's wrong with us building up our military somewhat now that we're getting economically more powerful when you, the United States, are much more powerful militarily than us? the United States didn't see it that way. The United States saw every step that China was taking to defend itself as an offensive move against the United States. As you know, Glenn, this is the classic security dilemma. Anything that one state does to defend itself looks offensive to the other side. And the end result here is that the Chinese began to build up their military capabilities as they got more powerful. And I also believe they began to think about dominating East Asia. And as I said before, it makes perfect sense from their point of view. If you're the Chinese, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want the United States military in your face? Do you want the United States military in East Asia? If I'm Chinese, if I'm Deng Xiaoping's or Xi Jinping's national security advisor, and they ask me, what do I think of the American military presence in East Asia? I say, I want the Americans out. I don't want the Americans in my backyard. Look, in the United States, we have the Monroe Doctrine. We do not want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere. Well, if we don't want the Chinese in the Western Hemisphere, why should the Chinese want the Americans in East Asia? And the answer is they shouldn't. So as China grows more powerful, you should expect the Chinese to want to push the Americans first out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. From their point of view, this makes eminently good sense. And of course, the Americans are not going to be happy about this any more than the Japanese, the Filipinos, or the Australians are going to be happy about this. So there's going to be huge pushback. And this, of course, is what you're getting today. So I think what's happened here, Glenn, in a very important way, is those ideologies that underpinned American thinking and Chinese thinking in the 1990s and in the first, decade and a half of the 21st century did not work out the way people anticipated. The world did not become peaceful. Confucianism and liberalism did not provide magic formulas for allowing China to rise peacefully. I think what happened here is that basic realist logic kicked in once you began to move away from unipolarity. Once China began to reach a point where it could be considered a great power, and once Putin brought the Russians back from the dead, and you had three great powers instead of one great power. Realist logic was back on the table, as someone like me would expect. Now, am I happy about this? No. My book, where I lay out my realist theory, is entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I'd like to underline the word tragedy. I think this is tragic, this situation that we're in with regard to U.S.-China relations. But I think this is just the way the world works when you're in an anarchic system, when you're in a system where there is no higher authority. This is what you should expect. And this is why I was arguing for a long, long time during the unipolar moment that you would eventually reach the point that we're now at. But it is a tragic situation. I regret that this is where we're at. Now, you asked the question, where is this all headed? My view is you want to separate security competition from war. And I think there's no question you now have, and you're going to have for the foreseeable future, an intense security competition between the United States and China. It has a military dimension for sure, and this includes the alliance structures that the United States has fashioned in East Asia, and it has an economic dimension that mainly revolves around cutting-edge technologies. That competition is here to stay for the foreseeable future. There's no question about it. But the really important question is whether or not we're going to have a war between the two sides. And this is a subject that concerns me and virtually everybody else who looks at what's going on in East Asia today. I do not think war is inevitable. And you want to remember that during the Cold War, and here we're talking about the security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the United States was working mightily to prevent the Soviets from dominating Europe. and even East Asia, we did not have a war. It ended peacefully. We definitely had an intense security competition, and there was an ever-present danger of war, as the Cuban Missile Crisis points out, and the various Berlin crises as well. But thankfully, we did not have an actual hot war. And my great hope is that moving forward, the security competition in East Asia, which is not going to go away, will not result in a hot war.
I do remember the ideological mood of the late 90s and early 2000s, the optimism. I think the realist correction to, well, a lot of this assumption, again, based on liberal theory, was that interdependence would be this absolute gain that would produce peace. I think the realist approach to political economy focused more on the relative gains, so who gains the most. And I think this interdependence you saw between the Americans and the Chinese is every year production power shifted from the US to China. Every year China developed a more advanced technology. Every year the Chinese were climbing up the global value chains, disrupting the international distribution of labor. And US debt kept growing, and the Chinese kept taking it over. So, you know, the relative shift in power, I think, always put a pressure to, we reached a point now where the Americans are concerned about how big China is. And of course, China also feels that it's grown too big for the American-led regional security architecture. So, you know, this mutual suspicion, I think, was yes, destined to create some tensions. It's just hoping there would be some magical solution to alleviate this. But I have to say, as a you can say the Chinese who follow the Confucian ideology, they nonetheless seem to be very accommodating of your ideas, as I keep saying on Chinese political discussions. So,
if I could make one quick point, Glenn, additional point. When I first started going to China in the early 2000s to talk about the rise of China, the argument that was most frequently used in China regarding why China could rise peacefully was not the Confucianism argument. That was certainly used. But the argument that was used most frequently was the economic interdependence argument, which you were just alluding to. And it was very interesting. The Chinese believed that as they got richer and richer, and they got hooked on capitalism, and economic interdependence became the order of the day, that there was no way the United States and China could go to war because you would in effect be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. In other words, prosperity depended on the absence of war and the prevalence of cooperation between the United States and China. And everybody was interested in prosperity. That was the principal goal of China, and that was the principal goal of the United States. So economic interdependence would be the magic formula, and it would reinforce Confucian ideology. Now, my response to that back then, and of course it's still my response, is that economic interdependence assumes that the key goal of states is prosperity. And there is absolutely no question that prosperity matters enormously to states. I'm choosing my words carefully here. Prosperity matters enormously to states, both China and the United States. So I can see why people were making that argument. But what they were forgetting is that survival always has to be the principal goal. And survival trumps prosperity, because obviously if you don't survive, you don't prosper, okay? And survival in an anarchic system means that you care greatly about the balance of power, as I emphasized at the beginning of the show. So what this meant was that as China grew economically more powerful, even though you did have this economic interdependence, and even though it made everybody on both sides more prosperous, the fact is that China growing more powerful would be seen as a threat to American survival. This is just the way international politics works. Again, I'm not happy about this, but if you study international politics long enough, you can't help observing this basic phenomenon. So China grew powerful as economic interdependence theory predicted. There was a great deal of prosperity on both sides, but nevertheless, what really drove the Americans after, I would say, roughly 2017 was a word that you used early on in the conversation: fear. Fear of China. And why was there fear of China? Because China was getting very powerful, right? All that prosperity, all that economic prosperity was leading to a militarily more powerful China. And that's going to generate fear in East Asia with regard to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and so forth and so on. It's going to generate fear in the United States. And the end result is you're going to get security competition in East Asia, which is going to trump all of that economic interdependence theory. And I think in good part, this is exactly what's happened over time.